In this video I explore a birds and dinosaurs themed turn-based strategy game to find out what an 8-bit 4X can teach us about designing decisions for players. And although what we're going to learn here is based on a deceptively heavy little strategy game, it does have implications for other genres too. If you're unfamiliar with UFO50, it's a set of 50 games all designed around the limitations of a 1980s Famicom era console with 8-bit graphics and just 2 buttons on the controller. Now, I still have quite a lot left to explore in UFO50, but I've already had 2 major surprises which I'm going to share now because they're not really spoilers about any of the content, they're more broad general observations. And then I want to deep dive into this one specific game to explain what it can show us about the design of strategic choice in games more generally. The first big surprise for me is that none of the games that I've played so far in the collection feel like a direct rip-off of anything else. Sure, there are familiar genres, but every single game has a unique concept. But the second thing that really stood out to me about UFO50 is the amount of games on it that are in the quote, thinky category. These range from things like this charming but infuriating koala-themed soccer band block pusher to the chess-like Bug Hunters, which shares some DNA with Into the Breach. But the game which really stole my heart in the first couple of sessions with UFO50 was Avianos. Avianos is a game of strategic conquest where the player leads an army of bird people who have to defeat an opposing tribe of bird folk by capturing resources, building utility structures, and whittling down the enemy forces until they are able to hold the majority of the land's towers unchallenged. Designer John Perry has packed a surprising amount of strategic depth into a game which is not only one in a set of 50, but as I said earlier, only uses 2 buttons and some directional keys. It's broadly understood that the console controller is the natural enemy of the strategy genre. Even masochists like myself who manage to play top-down strategy games on consoles will generally admit that the noble mouse is a much more natural way of issuing orders to lots of tiny people on a screen. Yes, I did play Romance of the Three Kingdoms 4 Wall of Fire on a SNES emulator. I punished myself with dozens of hours of theme park management and endless commanding and conquering with only a PS1 controller to issue my childish decrees.
All those moments will be lost like tears in rain.
But bear with me because one of the things that makes Avianos work with such simple controls is the way that the decisions in the game are designed, and that is the real focus of this video. Like many games in the UFO50 collection, Avianos initially looks and feels exactly like an 8-bit game made in the stated year, in this case 1985, but play for more than 10 minutes and you'll usually see some sort of modern design sensibilities shining through. Avianos manages to capture a good chunk of the strategic depth of a modern 4X game like Civ, despite only using 2 buttons. And the reason it can do this is because it uses something that, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to call compound action selection. At the start of each turn, a player will choose one of 5 dinosaur gods to pray to. Each of them's appropriately dressed and themed to give you some clues as to what they are all about. As you might expect, the big scary red Rexodon provides the most directly aggressive military actions, while the peaceful Brontor is all about growing your economy and building things to take care of your fledgling bird people. And while there are 5 of these dino deities, at the start of each turn you'll only ever have 3 of them available to pick from. Selecting a dino god locks them in place for that turn, and then you have to work through their 3 available sub-actions from top to bottom. This is quite a contrast from a regular 4X game like Civ, where every turn sees every player potentially moving every unit they own, issuing some construction order in every city, and so on. In Avianos, there are whole turns where you might not spend any workers to build, or you might not recruit forces using your seeds. Because yes, they're birds and that's what you pay them with. You may or may not accrue or spend bones on magical rituals. Depending on which god you've chosen, you might not move any units, and if you do, this could happen in a different place in that series of 3 sub-actions. Now, this might sound really complicated, but it's a type of complexity where the micro decisions you might be asked to make are locked in under broader, vaguer choices. That big choice of which dino god to go with at the beginning of your turn. Worried that you're not producing enough resources? Well, you're going to focus on the god that lets you build new resource generating buildings and worry about the specifics of that later on. If you're feeling unmatched in terms of the size of your army, you're going to double down on the military gods like Rexodon and worry about the specifics of that after you've selected them. The flow of a turn comes down to making one big chunky decision, i.e. what kind of turn am I going to have, and then making several smaller decisions based on that. On a turn when you choose Rexodon, you'll be focused on making units before moving them around into strategically advantageous positions, but when you invoke the Peaceful Brontor, you won't train or move units at all. Each of the actions you can take from each of the deities can usually be taken more than once. For example, if I'm using a build action to create a big old bird bath for my workers, I can do it on multiple tiles and as many times as I want, as long as I have the relevant resources. But the move action can only ever be used once per turn, which means that consolidating armies together into one larger force can often take several turns, and this limitation, while really frustrating, really emphasizes the need to plan ahead and in the long run for you to upgrade your actions so that you can produce more units in more different types of places on the board and to be able to move them around more freely, like diagonally or across previously impassable mountains. And that's where the action stacking of Avianos gets another layer of depth. Every time you use the same god, they receive 1 point of favour, which is basically XP. Every 2 points of this grants a little star representing a blessing, which allows you to upgrade one of their sub-actions. Sometimes these upgrades are as simple as reducing the cost of something that they can already do, like making my nasty zappy lightning bolt spell cost 4 bones instead of 7. Cha-ching! Or their movement action might get upgraded to include diagonal movement or even the ability to perform a surprise attack. Sometimes these upgrades can also diversify the portfolio of a particular god, for example, making them produce a wider variety of units in new circumstances or allowing them to produce resources that they initially couldn't. And the Peaceful Brontor also has a miracle which allows you to additionally upgrade the other gods even faster. By the end of a longer match, you'll usually have upgraded all of the gods all of the way, but the order in which you do this can dramatically change the way that the board feels throughout the game. Do you focus entirely on your economy of buildings, workers and military units? Or do you specialise in magic early on, levelling up the shamanic Trilock so you can more quickly acquire bones and more cheaply convert those bones into aggressive spells so that you can blast armies from afar, spy on your opponent with the eye of Dinosauron, or teleport over mountains straight into their domain? This whole setup of compound actions with multiple upgradable subcomponents reminded me a lot of one of my favourite board games. Scythe is a rich, complex game of empire building and expansionism which came out in 2016 and at the time of this video still sits in the top 20 games on the Board Game Geek charts. The simplest way to describe that game is Risk on steroids. If you haven't played Scythe yet but are familiar with some other modern board games, then this is a dudes on a map area control game like Blood Rage or Kemet, with a layer of worker placement resource management similar to Agricola. It's a peanut butter and jelly kind of game which blends together things which shouldn't really work into something which does. For the uninitiated, Scythe looks like a painfully complicated game, and to some degree it is, but by using compound action selection, it mitigates some of the analysis paralysis which can be caused when players have too much to think about at one time. Sure, you're still going to be more likely to succeed once you understand the game well enough to be able to think ahead and actually plan, but just like Avianos, each turn really consists of picking between one of 4 meta actions, each of which then has subcomponents which can be individually upgraded. In both of these games, you can see the compound action selection mechanic doing a lot of heavy lifting to reduce the amount of cognitive load on the player. Players begin their turn by making one decision, which defines generally what they are doing on that turn, and then a few smaller decisions based on that. This is very different from the experience of playing a modern 4X game like Civilization, Age of Wonders, or whatever the third game is that some nerd will get angry about if I don't mention it here. Often the user experience in these games comes down to repeatedly clicking a next button to cycle through every city or army you control, issuing an order to every single one and hoping that the grand sum of all your actions you take in that round amounts to some long-term strategic benefit for you. In Avianos, your top-level decision about which god to honour defines every subsequent action in your turn. Not only that, but because God's blessings unlock based on how frequently you pray to that specific god, each turn to some degree defines your long-term strategy because you're more likely to keep reusing the gods that you've already used and therefore upgraded because it's better value to do so. I'm giving you these two examples because I think that fans and designers of strategy games can learn a lot from them and how they use this compound action selection to give you a lot of strategic depth while taking away some of the turn-to-turn burnout that you might experience from having to move every single little piece around the board and make so many micro decisions, some of which don't feel particularly interesting at the time. Because these top level decisions about what kind of turn to take temporarily lock these big decisions about what kind of turn to take temporarily lock a player out of some of the actions in the game, and this can create an interesting texture and cadence purely because the player is then not doing everything on every turn. Giving players one large strategic decision to make first, which delimits and frames their later, smaller tactical choices, doesn't just make a game easier to process mentally, it also makes you feel a lot more like a ruler and less like a middle manager. When I loaded up UFO50, I was looking forward to being pleasantly surprised by the sheer breadth and variety of games in there, but I was absolutely not expecting to find a miniaturized version of Scythe themed around violent foul. Like most of the games in this collection, Avianos is a cute little experiment which combines themes and mechanics in ingenious new ways, but it's also an absolute masterclass in cramming strategic complexity into a simple interface in a way which leads to a game which is deep without being overwhelming. By utilising compound action selection, Avianos gives players tons to potentially do without necessarily requiring them to battle with their controller to make 1,000 micro actions every turn. But there's another thing about this kind of action selection which I think is important for designers to think about, and it's something which applies to a much wider variety of games than just turn-based strategy titles. When I have to choose between three options which are all quite different from each other, the choice is no longer about just what do I want to use or what do I want to keep, but it's also a choice about what to forego for later on, and am I going to regret losing that thing that I've just thrown in the bin? This is actually one of the main things that makes deck builders so enjoyable. When you level up, you are picking one benefit from a very small set of options. This feels very different from putting a point into a skill tree or a tech tree, which in the best of cases can feel a bit daunting and unfair if you don't yet understand the game's mechanics, or at worst it can just feel a bit pointless because the available options are too similar or too passive and incremental. You're just adding 5% to something in a way that you're not going to feel in the game. When you're given 3 cards and told pick one of these and throw 2 away, that often feels like a much more substantial decision than putting a point into an abstracted, purely numerical skill. You kind of give people an easier decision to make, but it feels more meaningful. They have less options to choose from, they're less overwhelmed, but it also kind of feels more meaningful because you're fully cognizant of which two things you're choosing not to have when you choose the thing that you do choose. In terms of simplifying the choice, think of it this way. In situation A, I ask you where you want to eat. It's a totally open question. And you could say anything, and you might already have something in mind, but often when we're asked these questions, we're caught off guard and we feel kind of put upon by it. We feel annoyed, like, why didn't you already pick somewhere to eat? I don't want to have the responsibility for deciding where we eat and then we get there and it's terrible. But in situation B, I ask you if you want burgers, Mexican food, or Chinese food. And then based on your first choice, I give you 3 more options within that subcategory. This is the same structure of choice design that Avianos has. Now, I can almost guarantee that in our choosing where to eat scenario, situation B would get us to an answer much more quickly. If you had some dietary limitations, like you're going vegan or you're trying to eat less carbs, then we'd probably be able to choose even quicker because you're eliminating even more choices just by stuff that you've decided not to do. And of course, I'm not ruling out that there might be some situations where it's nice to ponder a massive tech tree and all of the possible permutations of your actions over the next 10 hours of a game. But it is worth thinking about the ratio of cognitive effort to impact in the game, especially in cases where a player is being asked to make similar sorts of decisions over and over and over again. The deliberate cutting down of options isn't just for games like Scythe and Avianos. It's happening all the time in our roguelikes. When I finish a level in Downwell or when I clear a room in Hades, every time I pick a new card in Cult of the Lamb, these games repeatedly present players with choices from a very limited set and force them to discard some of the options. I'm not saying that games should never be complex and fiddly and micromanagey, and that can be its own kind of fun in some situations. There's definitely room for games that are like that. More that it helps to think of complexity in design as its own sort of economy. How frequently is your player asked to think about different things? And what is the kind of ratio of reward to the amount of thinking that they have to do? The example I've given you of compound action selection isn't necessarily saying if you're making a strategy game you need to copy this exactly. What I'm asking you to do is think about when your players have decisions to make and they're kind of looking at the resources available to them and they're looking at the state of the game, what kind of form do the decisions take? And is there a way of grouping them together that reduces some of the clicking and some of the thinking that doesn't really lead anywhere? And of course, thematically, the way Avianos does its thing might not make sense in other contexts. It does feel really goofy to have your preying choices determine the entire direction of civilization for a period of time. But the game is so cartoony and silly that this feels right, it feels appropriate. If this were made in a more naturalistic setting, this very cartoonish, caricatured, easy to understand approach would perhaps cause some problems with believability. For example, you probably wouldn't put your transportation advisor in SimCity in charge of the entire city and have them say, right guys, this is Train City now, we only care about trains for the entire financial year. Certain themes or settings or even art styles can lend themselves to a higher degree of abstraction, which makes these kind of more board gamey rules work in the context of a video game. But from my perspective, I've never been super into really minutely tedious simulationism that's about getting everything represented 100% accurately. So for me, Avianos achieves the perfect experiential blend of crunchy strategic thinking with the smashing together of colourful plastic toys.